Good evening, everyone. This is Gilgamesh. And today we are going to talk about the second half of Isaiah chapter 9 and the first four verses of chapter 10. If you are following along in a Hebrew numbering tradition of the chapter verses, we'll be starting in verse 7 of chapter 9. And if you are following along in the Christian King James Version, this will be verse 8 of chapter 9. I've spoken the previous ones around why those differences exist. And that actually opens up really something to understand about this. The whole concept of verse numberings and chapters is a much later invention. It was actually invented by Christians, and the Jews immediately adopted it because it was a great idea, an easy way to reference specific parts of the Bible. But of course, they couldn't agree on exactly where the divisions would be. Now, for the most part, probably about 90% actually lines up. If you get a copy of Strong's Concordance, they actually have a really useful page there that lists every difference in numbering between the two systems. There is a number of places where it doesn't line up exactly the same, and all of the chapter and verse divisions were made much later and are a little bit arbitrary at times, and this is a good example of where that happens. The first four verses of chapter 10 clearly belong to the same as the second half of chapter 9. If I were doing the chapter divisions on this, I would take this through where we're starting today, verse 7. I would take those first 6 verses of chapter 9, or verse 7 if you're looking at like the King James, and I would put all of those back in chapter 8. And I would take where we're starting today through the end of chapter 9 and then the first 4 verses of chapter 10 and put them together. And that seems a no-brainer because we're talking about a single cohesive poem that is through this section. There are 4, we're going to call them stanzas. There are 4 stanzas to this poem that 3 of them appear at the last half of chapter 9, and then the 4th one appears in chapter 10. And they clearly go together because they have the exact same refrain on all of them. Now, if you remember, back in chapter 5, we talked about that there was yet another stanza that ends with this refrain, and there's some idea that maybe it is mislocated, that a scribe at some point, just in his exuberance to copy things down, got the wrong part of the scroll and copied it in the wrong place, and then just kind of went, oops, guess it lives here now. Whether that's true or not is hard to say. We're going to look at that a little bit, and you can tell me what you think about it in the comments. It's far from settled, and there's something to understand in general. When we're talking about internal evidence, it's really hard to say anything with certainty. Internal evidence, which is evidence that we get from the text itself, is always pretty much based on educated guesses. We understand a bit about the text and what it's saying, but we have to make a lot of assumptions and a lot of guesswork to try and put it together. Interpretations that are based on internal evidence are often the shakiest and the ones most subject to revision. And this goes for questions around authorship, around divisions of what parts of a chapter belong together, questions around when we think something was written. None of this is based on external evidence, which would be that we actually found manuscripts. We really don't have any manuscripts that are even close to the age of the text. The oldest we have are the ones that you will find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and those date only to the 2nd century BCE. With Isaiah particularly, we believe that at least portions of it were written in the 8th century BC, although there are some who would still put the entire text a century or two later than that. But we're going to talk about this longer poem here. And the thing that's notable about this poem is the recurring refrain, "For all this his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still." That occurs 4 times. As I said, there are 4 different stanzas here. And we start here in verse 7. And there are, in these 4 stanzas, each one sort of calls out a different kind of failure of the people. The first stanza calls out either pride, or actually, as I read it, I wonder if it's not calling out more of a failure of the political interactions with the surrounding people, particularly the making of alliances and even making of war with some of the surrounding cultures seems to be the focus of the first stanza, although it also does attribute that to their pride. Then the second stanza talks about the failure of leadership, both religious and political. The third stanza talks about civil war and infighting within the nation of Israel and also between the northern and southern kingdoms. and calls them out for that. And then the fourth stanza focuses particularly on the injustice to the weak elements of their societies, the widows and orphans. Each end in this recurring refrain of judgment here, that his anger is not turned away and his hand is stretched out still. If we want to take a fifth stanza from back in chapter 5, it generally is thought of as being put at the end. The problem is it's a little different in its structure. It doesn't seem to call out any particular sin of the people, and instead seems to just focus on how fierce the judgment of God will be, and then ends in the refrain. And so that's a bit of an argument not in favor of attaching it to this poem. Sometimes refrains are just popular in the culture and don't necessarily mean that it was part of the same composition. In fact, we will see in this a refrain that is quoted a little later in a completely different context. So that does happen. But verse 7, we start here with this pestilence the master has sent unto Jacob, and it will fall on Israel, and all the people will know, Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria. We have here the idea that there is this pestilence, and let's talk about that for a moment. The word in Hebrew is davar, which means word. And so the more traditional translation of this is that a word came from the Lord and was sent to Jacob. That's a strange arrangement to say it quite that way. And when we look at the Greek translation, we have a lot more of an idea of that this word meant some type of a disaster was sent among them. And the word davar, you must realize that Hebrew words did not have vowels, and the vowels were expected to be supplied by the reader. What we see in the Hebrew Bible today, if you were to get a modern edition, was added many, many centuries later. And it's perfectly rational to say that those vowels may not all be correct. And the word davar, which means word, could also be revoweled to a different word, dever. And you may notice it's the same consonants, but you've just changed the vowels to two short E vowels. So dever means a pestilence, a plague. It's the same word that they used like in the 10 plagues of Egypt on the cattle. It makes more sense in context here that this is a plague that the master has sent against Jacob. And I should note that the Dead Sea Scrolls actually put the tetragrammaton here, whereas our traditional text has the Hebrew word Adonai. But it makes more sense that it is a pestilence that the master has sent against Jacob. And especially as you put it with the next line here, it will fall on Israel. That sounds much more like a pestilence than just simply a message. And it will cause all the people to know. It calls them Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria. Both Ephraim and Samaria were names for the northern kingdom, Ephraim being its principal tribe, and Samaria, or Shomron, being its capital city. This is particularly an oracle of woe against the northern kingdom. Now, I will also point out here that inhabitants, plural, is a variant from the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. The traditional text has a singular inhabitant of Samaria, which is a little strange to say. So I think the Dead Sea Scrolls is a better reading there as well. This is an oracle of destruction against the northern kingdom. And so why is it happening? Seems to be what is revealed in the next line here. The conclusion of that verse in the beginning of the next one is, in pride and in arrogance of heart, saying, the bricks have fallen, but we shall build with dressed stones. The sycamores have been cut down, but we will put cedars in their place. This is possibly an allusion to the Tower of Babel. Babel was a bit of a byword for the overweening human pride, and the story in Genesis 11 shows us that idea of building something great out of pride. And so it's possible that we have some sort of a reference here as we mention pride and we mention this idea of building. The Israelites go beyond the builders of the tower in their pride and swelling heart by resuming their task of building after the brick structure has been raised and imagining that they can build it bigger and better with hewn stone. Well, I also should point out that hewn stone was the building material of Canaan, whereas bricks were used in other places such as Mesopotamia or even Egypt. The idea here is, though, that their smaller structure has been knocked down. Bricks were inferior to hewn stone. Hewn stone was meant for more monumental structures and was used in much grander architecture. And the same thing with sycamores being replaced with cedars, which cedars would be an even finer wood, the tallest trees in the region coming from the Lebanon area. They are also used elsewhere as a symbol of arrogance. Throughout the book of Isaiah, the cedars of Lebanon tends to represent arrogant people. The idea here is that they are going to build back better. Their structure has been knocked down, and they're going to build something even more. But what is the structure we're talking about? I don't think we're talking about any kind of physical building. We're talking about some plan has been thwarted, and so they're going to make a bigger plan. Seems to be what it's saying to me. And then we get this next somewhat puzzling statement. The Lord raises the adversaries of Rezin against him, and his enemies he provokes. Well, this is kind of interesting. Rezin is the king of Syria. If you recall what we've discussed in the previous chapters, Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel are in an alliance. And so the idea that the enemies of Rezin are being raised against him. Who's the him? Are they being raised against Rezin? Are they being raised against Israel? Not terribly clear. And to make it more interesting, the word for enemies of and the word for Rezin look a lot alike in Hebrew. The words are Astray, Rezin. And if you look at it here, for a dyslexic person, they look quite similar because those first two letters are just flipped on the next word. And a lot of people, including Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, suggest that maybe this was a copyist error. Maybe they accidentally duplicated this word, and it should actually be a single word, and that final noon that you see as a single stroke at the end there should instead be a vav, which would be a normal ending on this, and it might just say his enemies. And maybe Rezin or Rezin was just not supposed to be there at all. And what does that change? But the Lord raises his adversaries against him, and his enemies he provokes. Now we've taken Syria out of the picture and just saying that the enemies of Israel have been raised against him and his enemies are being provoked. So that is one way to read this statement. Another thought about it, Rezin and Israel would be allies during the reign of Pekah. Maybe his enemies are the Assyrians. And the Assyrians are the ones who are going to give the death blow to both Israel and Syria. And so against him might mean against Rezin, or it might mean against Pekah and Israel. It might be the Assyrians that are going to be the ones that are stirred up to come down and destroy them. And that might be a reference to this when it says that the enemies of Rezin will be there. Although it is strange to refer to Assyria as simply the enemy of Rezin. So it's not terribly clear. The other thing to note, though, is that Israel was not at all a stable place. There were a bunch of civil wars that occurred during the last 20 years of its existence as a nation. Rezin may have backed Pekah, but he also may have opposed other factions that were part of the kingdom of Israel as well that may have been competing for control. Just because Pekah was king doesn't mean that everybody was in favor of him. So there could be some real possible infighting being referenced there as well. Syria also may have had some internal strife resisting Pekah. And some of this, we just don't know a lot of these details. So basically, it's impossible to say exactly what this verse is trying to say or exactly how it ties into the next verse. Everyone is fighting with everyone up there right now. And so there is this alliance between Rezin and Pekah, but Pekah's grip on his throne is tenuous at best. There are a lot of internal factions fighting against him, and Rezin's kingdom of Syria is not at all united. So it's really hard to say with a lot of certainty how Isaiah saw this situation. Moving on to the next part here. The Syrians on the east and the Philistines on the west devour Israel with open mouth. And then we have the refrain, for all this, his anger is not turned away and his hand is stretched out still. The Syrians on the east and the Philistines on the west, well, it's a little bit more northeast, southwest on these people, but we're being somewhat general on our cardinal directions here. But the idea is that both Syria and the Philistines will eat Israel, devour Israel by opening its mouth and just swallowing them. And so the idea is their immediate neighbors, their immediate cultural neighbors, are going to be the cause of their destruction. Again, this is a little hard to parse because Syria was on their side and the Philistines were not, but weren't overly hostile to Israel either. So it's a little hard to say what's going on there. It may be that this is actually a criticism of the alliance with the Syrians, and that this is saying that that's going to turn against them. And this may be a criticism of their friendly relations with the Syrians and with the Philistines. It's really difficult to say. But again, we have this refrain here that his anger is not turned away and his hand is stretched out still. The image here is that even though this is going to happen, it's not over with, that the Lord is still angry with him, and the idea of his hand being stretched out still is because he's going to smack them. It's the idea that his hand is going to strike them. We're going to see this refrain a total of 4 times throughout the beginning of the next chapter. The other place that you find it is back in chapter 5, verse 25. Going to the second stanza here, it says, "The people did not turn to him who struck them, nor inquire of the Lord of hosts." Now, this is an iteration on that refrain. The people did not turn to him. Now, the word turn here also can mean to repent, and it is an obvious play on the word above where it says his anger has not turned. Turning is something that happens both to the Lord's anger and also to the hearts of the children of men as they repent. And so this idea of turning is a very important concept. And it also mentions he who struck them. And this goes to the idea of this outstretched hand, the hand that strikes. So even though he struck them, they did not repent, nor did they turn around and ask the Lord of hosts what was going on. And of course, we have Lord of hosts here, his military title in his dispensing of judgment here. So we continue this. "So the Lord cut off from Israel head and tail, palm branch and reed in one day." It's an interesting little metaphor, and it's not unique. This is why I said that sometimes refrains just happen in more than one place. This almost exact same phrasing, head and tail, palm branch and reed, also occurs in Isaiah chapter 19, verse 15, in a very different context. There it is speaking not of Israel, but of Egypt, and talking about judgment against Egypt. And so this was apparently a stock phrase that was going to be reused. The next part of this is often cited as a classic example of a gloss. Now, gloss, like the word where we get the word glossary, is an explanation. And the thought is that because there was concern that future readers would not understand what was being said, a later editor added an explanatory statement defining what was just said. I will say not everybody agrees with this, including some rather prominent people. Robert Alter, one of my favorite translators, believes this is not a gloss, but it is part of the original poem. So there's, again, quite a bit of room for disagreement and reevaluation of these things. But this is often cited as a classic gloss here. It says, "The elder and honored man, he is the head. The prophet, teacher of lies, he is the tail." We basically are just defining our symbols here for us, that the head here is the political leaders, the elders, the honorable men, and the tail is the religious leaders. And it makes it clear here that they are talking about false prophets as they equate him with teacher of lies. The word here that is translated as honored man also literally means the one who is lifted up of face. Just an idiomatic way to say somebody who is honorable or of a high position. "For those who guide this people have been leading them astray, and those who are guided by them are swallowed up." The idea that this is a condemnation of the leadership of the country, that the leaders are leading them astray. Now, leading them astray, in some translations, you will see it translated as staggered, that the leaders of this people have staggered or stumbled. It can mean that way. It is a word that has multiple meanings, but that meaning doesn't seem to fit as well in context here. It also does clearly mean to lead somebody in the wrong path, which is similar to stumbling, but a little bit different in nuance. And that seems to be more what it's saying here, that the leaders have led them in the wrong path, have led them astray. And those that are being led are swallowed up. And so we go back to that imagery of being eaten by their neighbors. And that seems to be a bit of a recurring theme in this poem as well, that those that are being led wind up getting swallowed up. Now, the word swallowed up, you may see in some translations, it is translated as confused. That is also a possible reading of this word. But again, we've just talked about being eaten with an open mouth. So its meaning of being swallowed is much more likely in this context. Going forward, therefore the master does not rejoice over their young men and has no compassion on their fatherless and widows, for everyone is a hypocrite and an evildoer. Every mouth speaks folly. This one is a bit of a problem as well. Isaiah overwhelmingly defends fatherless and widows. And the idea that the master, God himself, is somehow not having compassion on them seems completely contradictory, not just to Isaiah, but also even later in this point. I will also say there's another problem with this, and this is the word here that says that the master does not rejoice over the young men. The Dead Sea Scrolls has a different word here. And the Dead Sea Scrolls say, therefore, the master does not have compassion on their young men. And that actually works nicely with the next line, which has a synonym for the word in Hebrew. It's two different words, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they mean roughly the same thing, to have compassion on somebody, and has no compassion on their fatherless and widows. So we'll translate the first one as mercy here. Therefore, the master does not have mercy on their young men and has no compassion on their fatherless and widows. Makes a nice parallel. The Dead Sea Scrolls reading is probably the correct one. I wonder if the word Adonai, which is translated as the master here, is actually a scribal error. The good thing is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia agrees with me. Now, this was an interesting thing because I had this in my notes from a year and a half ago, and as I was freshening things up to put it on YouTube here, I was finding, as I looked at BHS, I couldn't find that it said that the word Adonai was a scribal error and should be removed. And it turns out that my digital copy of BHS, which is from the software Accordance, has an error here. I had to break out my good old hard copy of this in order to see that the correct thing was that the BHS had actually said that it was an error here. So the BHS thinks that this word should be removed, and that suddenly makes the verse make a lot more sense if you remove the reference to deity. My translation after removing that word is, therefore upon his young men he has no compassion, and his fatherless and his widows he has no mercy. For everyone is a hypocrite and an evildoer, and every mouth speaks folly. So suddenly what's happening here is the antecedent to the pronoun is the people themselves. The leaders, or the ones being led, are the ones who are treating the widows and the orphans badly and not giving those that are the weak in society their proper due. And that fits both with later statements in this same poem and also general larger themes in Isaiah. And it just makes more sense overall. So I think I have to agree with BHS here that I think that the word Adonai was misplaced by putting it in this verse, and that it makes a lot more sense if it's not there. And then we end it with our refrain again. For all of this, his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. Then we come into the third stanza. For wickedness burns like a fire, it consumes briars and thorns, it kindles the thickets of the forest, and they roll upward in a column of smoke. Nice imagery here of a fiery end. The verb here that is translated as roll upward only occurs here, and so the translation's a little bit of a guess, but in context it seems to be that's a very logical guess of what smoke would be doing. The idea here also that it's going to burn the briars and thorns. We again have this imagery of briars and thorns, and these words are specific to Isaiah. Nobody else uses these words, and it seems that Isaiah has something very specific in mind here. Perhaps they represent the wicked leaders who take the people astray. It's not ever really clear exactly what these briars or thorns are, but they do seem to have some very specific meaning, and they form a nice alliteration as well in the Hebrew. We've discussed those in previous episodes, and we're going to see them a few more times. Then we have this statement, through the wrath of the Lord of hosts, the land is scorched. Now, the word scorched, again, shows up only here, and we don't really know what it means. It's just a guess from context. We're talking about burning everything before, and we know that through the wrath of the Lord of hosts, the land is something. Scorched seems to make the most sense, but it's not the only guess. Other guesses that are out there are the land is darkened, the land is shaken, the land is overcome with giddiness. I'm not making that up. That's straight from Hallot. There's also another one, the land is submerged, which seems to be a completely different metaphor. Just to make this even more interesting, two of the Dead Sea Scrolls, two of the different copies of Isaiah, and there are multiple copies of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but two of them have the middle two letters of this word reversed, which you would think would help something, but it doesn't, because we don't know what that word would mean either. That's not a word either. So it seems likely that even by the time of the authorship of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they didn't know what this word meant anymore, and spelling errors become more common when you don't know what the word means that you're trying to copy. That's the theory anyway. The land is something, and scorched seems to be the logical conclusion of what it would be, especially following with the next two lines here. And the people are like fuel for the fire. A man to his brother he does not spare. The people are being burned up in the fire, and I kept the Hebrew idiom here, a man to his brother. That's what the Hebrew literally says here, although some people will use a little bit more smoother English on that. I think the idiom is important here because we're talking about that brother is turning against brother, and this was a time of great civil war, and that seems to be a lot of what we're talking about here, and you're going to see this continued in the next bit. Now, if we accept the Dead Sea Scroll reading for verse 16 above, that there is no compassion for the young men, where I mentioned that the Dead Sea Scrolls had a different word there. If we accept that reading for verse 16 above, well, then that same phrase is showing up here again with that a man to his brother, he does not have compassion. And so this is actually the same word that the Dead Sea Scrolls have just a little bit before at the beginning of the stanza. And so that does seem to, again, to be a likely reason to accept that as a good reading, that we're now coming back to the idea that people are not having compassion on their own brothers. And we go on with this further here. They slice meat on the right, but are still hungry. They devour on the left, but are not satisfied. Each devours the flesh of his own arm. Now, the verb that's translated as they slice meat is a bit of a guess. This is a recurring theme in Isaiah. This word only occurs here. And so we have to take a bit of a guess as to its meaning. There is some possibility it might be a closer synonym that just generally means to devour or to eat, which is what we have in the next line that it is parallel to. This is the current guess, is that it means to slice meat. But the idea here is that you're consuming, but you're not actually getting rid of your hunger. And you wind up devouring the flesh of his own arm, which is a bit of a gruesome metaphor. It's possible that this is meant to be just a hyperbolic expression, but it's generally agreed that it looks a bit strange. The Septuagint and the Targum, which is the Aramaic translation, ancient Aramaic translation of the Bible, they change this by dropping off the first letter and coming up with reo, which is his fellow man or his neighbor. And so this could be, if there's one letter difference there and the one letter was an error in scribal transmission, it could mean that he devours the flesh of his own neighbor, bringing about much more of an idea of cannibalism. Now, cannibalism is something that is addressed several times in the Hebrew Bible and is generally associated with siege warfare, where you surround a city and starve them to death, and then they start eating each other. This could be a reference to that. It does make a bit more sense than eating your own arm, although the idea of self-injury to satisfy appetite does have some resonance as well, so either one could work. Now, the other possibility is, again, vowels were added later, and if you change the vowels for the word for arm, it could be the word for seed. And if that is the case, he devours the flesh of his own seed, it's talking about someone eating their own children. And that's probably the most extreme of these metaphors. Well, actually, that's the most extreme of these possible meanings. I don't know that it's really a metaphor. But any way you slice it, this is talking about that a man is not caring for the things that he should care for, whether that is his brother or his own self, that he is in a state of consuming left and right and not satisfying his hunger until finally he turns on the flesh, either of himself or of his friends or of his family. So it is a bit of a horrific image that we draw through this. And then we have this next verse, which is just kind of fun. It says, Manasseh, Ephraim, and Ephraim, Manasseh. There's actually no verb in it. So the idea here, though, is that the verb to devour or to eat probably is understood as carrying over to this clause. So Manasseh devours Ephraim and Ephraim devours Manasseh. That's the idea behind it. Although the way it's actually written is without a verb, just one as the subject and the other as the direct object, and then reversed, making a nice little chiasm, actually. But the idea here is that there is civil war. Manasseh and Ephraim were the two biggest tribes in the northern kingdom. And it's saying that they are devouring each other. They are competing for control over that northern kingdom, and they are at war with one another. And then it adds, together they are against Judah. Judah was the southern kingdom where Isaiah lived. And although they are warring with each other to the north, they can unite to go to battle against their brothers of Judah. And so this is a terrible state of all sorts of internal civil conflict that is going on in this northern kingdom. And for all of this, his anger is not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. Now, coming to the first verse of chapter 10, and if you're following along in the different Christian or Jewish numbering traditions, we now finally are back on the same page. This is chapter 10, verse 1. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression. Now, I tried to preserve in the translation here that these are both cognate accusative in Hebrew, which is where you have your verb and your noun coming from the same root, so they sound similar. We have here those who decree decrees and those who write writings. And so this is the idea that these are the lawmakers. These are the ones who write out the laws and the decrees. So we're talking about political leadership here primarily, and the legislative body. The emphasis here is on the educated and the lawmakers who write laws that are unfair, which shows us that the good book teaches us that you can never trust an attorney. Going on to verse 2, to turn aside the needy from justice, and to rob the poor of my people of their right, that the widows may be their spoil, and that they may make the fatherless their prey. Now, the words spoil and prey there are the words shalal and baz, which happen to be part of the name of Isaiah's second son, the third wonderful child, Maher Shalal Chashbaz. This may be a reference back to that his name and his birth were an indication of the end of this kingdom. The interesting twist to that is this is not that they are a spoil to the invading Assyrian army, but that they are a spoil to their own people, that their own people, the weak of them, are being spoiled and preyed upon by their own political leaders. And so this is an actual condemnation of them, and making that they themselves will be spoiled by the Assyrians, as the name suggests in Isaiah's son, being a bit of poetic justice, that they are receiving exactly what they are being accused of doing to the weak and powerless in their society. What will you do on that day of punishment, in the storm that will come from afar? The word punishment could also be that day of visitation. Either translation is fine. Now, the idea here, some translations, particularly older ones, will say the ruin that will come from afar. That's probably a misunderstanding of the word. If you look in the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, we're pretty clear at this point that this word means a coming storm. And so that gives nice dramatic flair to this, in my opinion. So what will you do in that day of punishment, in the storm that's going to come from afar? And obviously this is going to be the invading armies of Assyria that will end this kingdom. To whom will you flee? And where will you leave your wealth? So all this money they have acquired by spoiling the poor and the widows, what are they going to do with all of it when an invading army comes in? Do we really benefit from these worldly possessions. Now, the word wealth here could also be translated as glory. Some people do that. The main meaning of the word, though, is to be heavy. And so the idea is this is something that weighs them down, that their wealth, what are they going to do with it? If you're fleeing, the last thing you need is a bunch of heavy gold. Who are you going to leave that with? And what are you going to do when you're having to run away with all your heaviness, all of your wealth? And then we have a great little chiasm in the next verse here, end it all off here. Nothing remains but to kneel among the prisoners, among the slain, to fall. Very resounding words of finality there, that these in the northern kingdom particularly who are spoiling the poor will themselves become prisoners or be killed. For all of this, his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. And so that brings us to the end of the poem that is here in its current form at the end of chapter 9. Now, if you want to relocate the part from chapter 5, most people agree it would go here at the end. And it's a little bit different. It doesn't call out a particular sin, but it does give a very vivid description of the kind of destruction that is going to come. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he stretched out his hand against them and struck them. And the mountains quaked, and their corpses were as refuse in the midst of the streets. For all this, his anger is not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. We have here a very explicit reference to the Lord striking his people. And so this does go back to that they haven't turned to the one who struck them. There's a lot of similarities there. We have a very vivid idea that as he does this, the very mountains quake. And this could be memories of an earthquake which happened, which there was a big one. The idea of corpses lying like garbage in the streets could be the result of a great battle. Hard to say what else would cause corpses to be laying around in the streets, but others have proposed that maybe they were, because of an earthquake, fell out of their graves or something. I think that's a bit far-fetched. But the idea here is that this will be a horrible thing. Now, not everybody's in agreement that this should be moved over here, and I will actually link to a paper in the comments of somebody who argues the opposite point, and we really don't know, but it might go here. This might be a place where it goes. If you think it goes here, one of the things in favor of it is the next part of it, verses 26 through 30 of chapter 5, look like they are an introduction to the next poem which comes up, and we'll have to look at that together as well in our next discussion. But it says, he will raise an ensign for nations far away and whistle for them from the ends of the earth, and behold, quickly, speedily they come. None is weary, none stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps, not a waistband is loosed, not a sandal strap broken. Their arrows are sharp, all their bows are bent, their horses' hooves seem like flint, their wheels like the whirlwind, their roaring is like a lion. Like young lions they roar, they growl and seize the prey, they carry it off, and none can rescue. They growl over it on that day like the growling of the sea, and if one looks to the land, behold, darkness and distress, and the light is darkened by its clouds. All of this could fit very nicely right before the next part of chapter 10, which says, woe to Assyria, rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury. So if we wanted to relocate it, we would probably relocate that last part as well to here as an introduction to that upcoming poem on the king of Assyria. Anyway, that's what we got today. Hope you enjoyed it. If you like, please like and subscribe and ring the bell, and we'll get you on the next one. Everybody have a wonderful Purim and have a good evening.